You know that gut feeling you get when something is off? Like when a quiet storm is building and everyone around you pretends it is just a breeze. That was me, standing in the open concept floor of Cormac Freight's headquarters, watching Brandon Cormac stroll in like he owned the future. My name is Avery Callahan. I am 38 years old, born and raised in Tucson, Arizona, but I have called Chicago home for the past 16 years. For the last 12 of those years, I served as the senior systems architect at Cormac Freight Systems, one of the top logistics and freight companies in the Midwest. Or at least it used to be. I was the architect behind the back-end software that kept every container tracked, every truck scheduled, every customs document clean. And then came Brandon with his buzzwords, boardroom arrogance, and not a clue what my code even did. Brandon is the CEO's son. That already tells you more than I need to. 33, loud when he should have listened, and addicted to LinkedIn jargon like digital pivot and streamlining legacy systems. He strutted into the office that Monday morning like a walking TED Talk in a tailored suit one size too tight, flanked by consultants and trailing the smell of overpriced cologne and undercooked ambition. Within 15 minutes, I was summoned to a glass-walled meeting room and offered lukewarm coffee like I was a guest in my own company. "We're rethinking our infrastructure," Brandon said, barely looking up from his tablet. "Your systems have been great, really, but we are sunsetting the old stuff. You will be moving into a support role starting next quarter." That word, support, hit me harder than any layoff notice ever could. I did not even blink. Not because I was not angry, I was boiling, but because this was not the first time I had been underestimated by someone who had never written a single line of production code. Support role? After I rebuilt their freight routing system from scratch in 2013, after I salvaged their API failures when customs integration went haywire in 2017? I smiled, just slightly. "So, you're saying my architecture is now outdated?" I asked. Brandon leaned back, looking way too proud of himself. "Let's call it what it is, legacy tech. We have to make room for innovation." Translation: I was being quietly pushed aside so he could play CEO with shiny new toys and someone else's budget. But what he did not know, what no one remembered, was that I was not just a cog in the machine. I had laid the first brick, and I never gave away the blueprint. I went back to my desk without saying another word. I stared at my screen, pretending to type, while my mind was already 10 steps ahead. My hands hovered over the keyboard, but I was not writing code. I was replaying the clause in my head, Clause 9F, the one I had insisted on 15 years ago when I saved Cormac Freight from a catastrophic database collapse and stayed up for 6 straight nights to rebuild their systems. That clause gave me more than just peace of mind. It gave me rights, legal, binding rights, to everything built on top of my original architecture. That included the new interfaces they were so proud of. It was all mine, but Brandon clearly had no idea. That afternoon, I watched him hold a meeting with the strategy team and the IT leads, my team. From behind the glass wall, I saw him waving his arms, laughing, pointing at flowcharts I had made. One of the interns was nodding like he was learning from a genius. I had to bite my tongue. I wanted to walk in, unplug the smartboard, and draw the real architecture with a Sharpie just to show them how little they understood. But I stayed still. Anger was a weapon, and I was not going to swing it recklessly. Not yet. Not when I had something better. A contract, a flash drive, and the truth. That night, I walked out of the office slower than usual. I stopped by the server room one last time and just stood there, listening to the hum of the machines that I had helped bring to life. Brandon thought he had won. He thought he had swept me into some harmless little corner where I would sit and rot until I took the hint. But he forgot one very important thing. You cannot bury someone who built the ground beneath your feet. And I was not going to just sit in a support role while the company ran on my blood, sweat, and logic. No, I was going to do what I do best: plan, calculate, and execute. And the first step? Find the flash drive. The one labeled vacation photos taped under my drawer, waiting for the perfect moment to remind everyone who really wrote the story of Cormac Freight. Most engineers walk into a job hoping for good benefits, maybe a decent bonus, and the promise of a raise if they play their cards right. But when I walked into that boardroom 15 years ago, I asked for something different. I asked for protection. I asked for ownership. Back then, Cormac Freight was on the edge of collapse. A third-party vendor's bad update had wiped out half the routing data during peak freight season. Customs were jammed, our shipping app was dead, and 3 Fortune 500 clients were threatening to walk. I was only 23 at the time, a junior developer barely out of grad school, but I had already rebuilt our scheduling protocol during my internship. I knew the back end better than anyone, so when the CTO broke down crying in the break room, I took over. I rebuilt the system from the inside out in 6 days flat. I did not sleep, I barely ate, but when the company came back online, I asked for one thing in return. That thing became Clause 9F. I remember the smell of the stale coffee in that corner office and the way the company lawyer looked at me like I was insane. "You want equity?" he asked. "You are 23. But Gerald Cormac, the founder and CEO, was a different kind of man back then. Desperate, grateful, fair, at least on the surface. "Give her the clause," he said, rubbing his temples. So they did. 3% non-dilutable equity, full IP ownership of my original software framework, and veto rights over any executive-level restructuring that affected my system while it remained in use. Most people thought I was crazy, but I knew better. I knew how fragile memory could be in corporate America. If you do not write it down, it never happened. And so I wrote it down. I signed it, they signed it, and then I backed it up 6 different ways. A copy went to my lawyer, another went in my safety deposit box, and one more, just for fun, I hid on a flash drive labeled vacation photos, taped under the drawer in my desk. Over the years, people forgot. The clause was buried in a legal document most executives never read past the first page. Gerald never brought it up again. HR cycled through new directors every few years, and none of them knew it existed. But I never forgot. Every time I walked through that building and saw some young manager nodding along like they were the future, I smiled. Because I knew something they did not. I was not just an employee, I was part owner. And more importantly, I held the keys to the company's digital skeleton. Brandon Cormac had no idea what he had triggered when he pushed me into a support role. To him, I was just legacy tech. A relic from a simpler time, someone to move aside so he could install his cloud migration projects and AI dashboards. But he had not read Clause 9F. He did not know that his new shiny platform still relied on the routing tree I had authored, or that the inventory functions were still built on my scheduling logic. It looked new because they painted over it, but underneath it was still mine. Every shipment, every invoice, every truck, all of it flowed through my systems, and all of it was covered by my clause. So while Brandon pranced around the office giving pep talks about agility and future-ready systems, I sat at my desk and quietly pulled out the thumb drive. It was right where I left it, hidden under the drawer with a small piece of masking tape. I plugged it into my laptop that night and opened the folder. There it was. Scanned copies of the signed contract, a PDF labeled Clause 9F Agreement Final, and a clean summary of the framework dependencies that still ran the company. I zipped it all into one folder and sent it straight to Maxine Poe, my attorney of 11 years. I also copied Lydia Tan, one of the only board members who knew how to read a contract without asking for a summary. No threats, no rants, just facts. Cold, documented, time-stamped facts. The next morning, I walked into the office like nothing had happened. I smiled at Brandon as he held a meeting in the glass conference room, pointing to a diagram I had drawn 2 years earlier. He looked proud, smug even, but I knew better. I knew the truth. This was not about legacy code. This was about a legacy they had tried to erase. But I built it. I owned it. And now I had quietly reminded the people who mattered. Because when you try to cut out the brain of a system and replace it with buzzwords, there is always a crash. And this one was coming. All I had to do was wait. After the so-called reassignment, I did not storm out or slam any doors. That would have given Brandon the show he wanted. Instead, I packed my things slowly, carefully, like I had all the time in the world. My team looked confused, almost awkward, unsure if they should say goodbye or pretend this was just a normal day. I gave them polite nods, kept my smile fixed, and said nothing that could be quoted out of context. When I reached the bottom drawer of my desk, I peeled back the false panel I had installed years ago. There it was, my insurance policy, a black flash drive with a scratched label that simply read vacation photos. It had been untouched, exactly where I had left it, still taped beneath the drawer like a secret waiting to come alive. I slipped it into my purse and walked out with my chin up. I did not drive home right away. I went to a quiet corner of a coffee shop downtown, ordered a large black coffee, and pulled out my laptop. The flash drive clicked into place, and just like that, the past 15 years opened up before me. Every document, every clause, every dependency, every line of code I had contributed was there, all neatly organized into folders. I had updated it once every quarter without fail. I was never going to let someone pretend I had not built the bones of that company. That night, I zipped up the folder and sent it directly to Maxine Poe, my lawyer. She had been with me through 2 company mergers and a near acquisition that almost wiped out my claws. She knew the weight of what I had just sent her. I also copied Lydia Tan, senior board member and one of the few people in leadership who read every legal page before signing. Lydia was sharp, measured, and not easily impressed, but more importantly, she respected the work. She had seen me present on system architecture before Brandon had even graduated business school. I trusted her, not blindly, but enough to believe she would not delete my email without reading it. The subject line was short, Clause 9F, immediate review recommended. I added a brief note. Hi Lydia, this is time sensitive. Please confirm receipt. Documentation attached. Let me know if you would like a formal briefing. No anger, no threats, just facts, written like a professional who had already moved beyond the insult. By morning, the fuse had been lit. I did not have access to internal emails anymore, but word travels fast inside corporate walls, especially when legal gets involved. At 10:42 a.m., Maxine forwarded me a confirmation that Lydia had opened the email and downloaded the attachment. By noon, I had 3 missed calls from an unlisted number I knew belonged to the company's general counsel. I did not answer. I did not need to. The facts were out there now, and unlike Brandon's slide decks and speeches, my documents had teeth, signed agreements, timestamped system logs, and a digital trail that showed my frameworks were still very much alive and being used without consent. I will never forget the image of Brandon standing outside the boardroom that Friday afternoon, pacing, frowning at his phone. His tie was off, his sleeves were rolled up like he was trying to look busy, but the nervous tapping of his fingers told the real story. He had not seen it coming. He thought he had cleared me out, deleted my presence, moved on. But Brandon made one critical mistake. He thought being loud made him right. I had no interest in noise. I had leverage. And leverage, when timed right, makes more noise than a dozen press releases. That weekend, I received a formal letter from the company asking for a clarification on the scope of Clause 9F and its relation to the current software infrastructure. They called it a standard review, but I knew better. The moment Lydia confirmed receipt of that flash drive's contents, the clock started ticking. They could not pretend anymore. They could not deny I had built the core, and they definitely could not rewrite my code without facing the consequences. The house Brandon tried to build was standing on my foundation, and now he was learning what happened when you try to tear down the architect's name from the blueprints. This was not revenge, not yet. This was just the trigger. The fallout was still ahead. It did not take long. Just 4 business days after my exit, the cracks began to show. At first, it was small things, delayed updates in the scheduling dashboard, some flags not clearing in the order queue. But by the end of the week, those glitches had turned into full-on system chaos. Freight schedules began duplicating themselves without warning, showing 2 arrival times for the same shipment in 2 different cities. Trucks arrived at ports with no customs clearance. Containers meant for Oakland were sitting in Halifax. Clients were calling in, confused and angry, asking why their million-dollar shipments were showing up at the wrong ports. Inside the company, people started pointing fingers, but the common thread was clear. The new system was not working. What they did not want to admit, especially Brandon, was that there was no new system. Not really. They had taken my back-end logic, stripped it of the internal tags, and tried to layer on a prettier interface with none of the safeguards I had built over a decade. It was like swapping out the dashboard of a plane while it was mid-flight, then acting surprised when the autopilot failed. The dependencies were all still tied to my architecture. Every routing function, inventory handshake, and freight tracking operation still leaned on the Langford Freight Framework, the same system I had created, maintained, and expanded for 12 years. They had painted over it with buzzwords and hoped no one would notice, but code does not care about marketing. It either works or it fails. The real irony? The team Brandon blamed for the breakdown was the same team I had trained for years. They were good people, smart, loyal, but they were not prepared to debug something they had never been allowed to understand fully. Brandon had gutted documentation access, removed internal training modules, and replaced our internal wiki with a flashy AI chatbot that could not even answer basic freight queries. So when shipments failed and logs stopped syncing, no one knew where to start. Worse, the backup routines I had written, manual checks, legacy protocols, and data validation tools, had been removed in the name of modernization. There were no guardrails left. It was like watching a train derail in slow motion, knowing exactly when and how it would happen. Inside the company, panic set in. Brandon, in his usual style, started blaming everyone except himself. First it was the migration team, then IT, then procurement. He even called a meeting with the UX consultants to ask why the dashboard colors did not feel reliable. But no matter who he pointed to, the truth circled back to one undeniable fact. They had broken something they never understood. And worse, they had done it without a backup plan. I could have fixed it in 2 hours, maybe less, but they had removed me from the access tree, revoked my credentials, and never even thought to ask how it all worked, because Brandon believed he could replace knowledge with confidence. And now that arrogance was eating through the company's infrastructure like acid. Clients started pulling contracts. One of our European logistics partners sent a formal notice of breach. A shipping alliance in the Pacific threatened to suspend Cormac Freight's membership until our manifests matched up with customs reports. Revenue forecasts were slashed by 12% overnight. The company tried to issue a soft press release blaming supply chain turbulence, but no one bought it. Internal chats leaked. Employees began whispering the truth. "This is Dana's code. We broke it. We need her back." But Brandon refused to bend. He held another all-hands Zoom meeting where he talked about adaptability under pressure and short-term turbulence for long-term gain. The call lasted 30 minutes. Half the staff spent it frantically trying to patch what was unpatchable. I watched it all unfold from my apartment with a strange sense of detachment. I was not happy to see it fall apart, but I was not sad either. I had warned them. I had documented everything. I had handed over processes with care and precision, and they had thrown it away for the sake of ego. The fact that I was now the only person on Earth who could untangle that system? That was not revenge. That was just reality. They built this disaster with their own hands. I had simply stepped aside and let gravity do the rest. The message came at 9:42 p.m. on a Wednesday night. I was halfway through a bowl of instant ramen, still in my hoodie, and binge-watching a mindless cooking show when a LinkedIn notification popped up on my phone. It was from Eli Ruiz, one of the junior developers I had hired straight out of Cal Poly just before the reorg. I remembered him clearly, quiet, precise, curious about everything. I had mentored him for a few months, mostly teaching him how to troubleshoot real-world problems the textbooks never covered. He was one of the good ones. So when I saw his message, I knew it was not just a social check-in. "Hey Dana," the message read, "I know this might be out of line, but did you know your exact line structure is still live under the name Brandcore V2? I thought they were rewriting everything, but it looks like they just renamed your modules." I stared at the message for a full minute before responding. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, but I stopped myself from typing anything emotional. Instead, I said, "Thank you for letting me know. Save your messages. Do not delete anything." Eli responded with a thumbs-up emoji and one more line that made my stomach turn. He told me to start scrubbing all author tags from the core files tomorrow. I knew exactly what that meant. Brandon was trying to erase my name from my own codebase, not just the comments and documentation, but the architecture logs, the commit history, the digital signature tags I embedded for audit purposes. The Langford Freight Framework was still intact, just renamed and repackaged under Brandon's ridiculous new label, Brandcore V2. It was fraud, plain and simple. You do not steal someone's code, rename it, then claim it as your own. Not when that code is protected by a signed contract and federal IP laws. And especially not when your father, the real CEO, is still technically on the board and bound by those same agreements. Eli told me that Brandon had pulled him aside earlier that day and said, "Make it clean. If any of the old system names pop up, strip them. Legacy references make us look weak." Eli had nodded at the time, unsure what to say, but the moment he opened the files and saw my structure untouched, my loops, my field validations, even my original debug notes still sitting in the metadata, he knew something was off. He did what every good engineer should do when asked to bury the truth. He flagged it. First to his direct supervisor, then to the company's ethics hotline, attaching screenshots and file timestamps. That was when things started to unravel. It did not stay internal for long. Someone on the legal team leaked the internal memo to a compliance reviewer at Meritech Ventures, one of Cormac Freight's biggest investors. Within 24 hours, Meritech sent a formal inquiry demanding clarification on software authorship rights and current architecture dependencies. The company tried to delay their response, but the damage was already spreading. Other partners began asking questions too. The Freight Alliance in Singapore requested system transparency before releasing their next payment. A customs liaison in Florida flagged discrepancies in the import API logs, citing unexpected syntax artifacts that matched my original schema. In other words, the code was still mine, and the world was finding out. Meanwhile, Brandon panicked. He called an emergency meeting with the dev leads and told them to double down on the rebrand. According to another message Eli forwarded to me, Brandon said, "If we can push out Brandcore 3.0 before next quarter, no one will care who wrote the first one." That was not strategy. That was desperation. You cannot rewrite 12 years of system architecture in a month, not with interns, not with consultants, not even with a miracle. You can slap a new label on a rotten product, but the bugs do not care about branding. And now, neither did the board. I did not have to lift a finger. My name was rising to the surface like ink in water. All Eli had done was point to the truth. The rest was gravity. People were finally connecting the dots. My work had been buried, stolen, white-labeled, and now exposed. There was no need to scream or retaliate. All I had to do was stand still while their lies collapsed under their own weight. Brandon had crossed a line. He thought code was invisible. But he forgot that the best code leaves fingerprints, and mine were everywhere. I was slicing strawberries in my kitchen when Lydia Tan called. Lydia was the kind of board member who rarely got involved unless something truly threatened the foundation. She had always been the sharpest one in the room, level-headed, unshakable, and deeply familiar with the fine print of every contract signed in the last 2 decades. She skipped the small talk. "Avery," she said, voice calm but clipped, "are you absolutely certain the active architecture they are using is yours?" I wiped my hands, walked over to my laptop, and within 3 minutes I had emailed her side-by-side screenshots, my original files alongside the current system logs. I also attached the document that started it all, Clause 9F of my employment contract. Clause 9F was not just a formality. It was an ironclad agreement drafted 15 years ago when I rebuilt Cormac Freight's digital backbone after a failed third-party software collapse. In exchange for doing the work solo, under budget, and ahead of schedule, I negotiated terms most engineers never even dream of. Ownership of my core logic, licensing rights, and most importantly, stakeholding privileges tied directly to my software's active use. As long as my systems ran, I had skin in the game. They could not fire me and keep the code. Not legally, not ethically. And now that Brandon had tried to bury that truth, the company was suddenly exposed on every front. The next morning, I got a call from Gerald Cormac, the founder and current CEO. His voice was tighter than I had ever heard it. "Avery," he said, "let's talk this through. I think we may have misstepped here. Perhaps we acted too quickly." That was rich, coming from the same man who had signed off on his son's restructuring plan. Gerald had always been charming, even fatherly, but in that moment, he sounded more like a man trying to pull the brakes after the train had already left the tracks. I kept my tone polite. I told him the documents had been forwarded to my legal counsel and that I was happy to discuss licensing terms, but not under duress. Gerald tried to stretch the call, fishing for a middle ground, but the moment had passed. By then, Lydia had already forwarded the materials to the rest of the board. And the board, those level-headed professionals with serious liability concerns, called for an emergency meeting. They had read Clause 9F. They had seen the commit logs, the unchanged architecture patterns, the time-stamped module names. They knew this was not about hurt feelings or corporate politics. It was about rights. It was about breach of contract. And it was about a software infrastructure their entire company was still running on. Software they no longer legally owned. What Brandon had done was not just careless. It was reckless. Firing me without severing the system they relied on was like evicting the landlord and hoping the house would run itself. The board realized they had more than just a lawsuit on their hands. They had an active liability that could trigger investor withdrawals, compliance penalties, and system downtime across every global shipping partner they had. For years, Cormac Freight had operated without a single major incident in logistics data. Now with Brandon's streamlining, they were days away from a full-scale credibility collapse. And the person holding the keys? Me. I was no longer just a laid-off techie with a grudge. I was a verified stakeholder with enforceable rights, a complete paper trail, and a spotless operational record. And now the board saw it clearly. My silence had not been weakness. It had been strategic. I had let the cracks form, the panic spread, and the truth surface without ever raising my voice. And now, all eyes were on me, not as a former employee, but as a decision-maker, someone whose next move could determine the future of the company. Gerald ended the call by saying, "Avery, we need to make this right." I said nothing, because now they were the ones waiting on me. By the end of the week, Brandon's badge stopped working on the executive elevator. I heard about it from Eli, who messaged me with one word: locked. Apparently, Brandon had thrown a fit in the lobby when the scanner light stayed red. Security had to escort him to the lower floors, and word spread fast. It was not a public firing, not yet, but everyone knew what it meant. His title might still be on paper, but his access was suspended. He had been benched, hard, no meetings, no approvals, no more running point on the digital strategy he never understood in the first place. His digital transformation play had cost Cormac Freight 2 major contracts in less than 10 days. One from Westrail Logistics, who demanded system transparency before releasing another shipment, and another from an Asian shipping partner who flagged protocol inconsistencies that traced directly back to his unauthorized code edits. Brandon had insisted on modernizing the infrastructure without knowing how to migrate the dependencies. That kind of sloppiness was not just embarrassing, it was dangerous. These clients ran billions of dollars worth of cargo. They could not afford glitches, and neither could the board. Gerald Cormac had no choice. He suspended his own son from all decision-making pending an internal investigation. The phrase he used in the memo was reassessment of leadership suitability. I did not celebrate, not out loud, but I would be lying if I said it did not feel like justice. Brandon had walked in like he owned the future and tried to bury the past. Me. He underestimated what I had built and who I was to the company. To him, I was just a legacy artifact. But now, with his access cut and his arrogance exposed, the board was finally looking at the truth. And with every passing hour, my silence grew louder. I had not spoken to the press. I had not gone public. I did not need to. The code spoke for itself, and so did the contracts. I was not just someone they wronged, I was someone they needed. Gerald reached out that Friday. His voice was strained again, but this time he led with sincerity. "Avery," he said, "I believe it is time we talk face-to-face." I agreed to a private meeting, no lawyers, just the two of us. He invited me to his house, not the office, because even he knew that what needed to be said could not happen under fluorescent lights and boardroom ceilings. I showed up at his place at exactly 3 p.m. He opened the door himself. No assistant, no formality. Just a tired man in a wrinkled dress shirt who looked like he had not slept in a week. We sat in his study, the kind of room where real decisions get made. Heavy wood shelves, a globe in the corner, the smell of old books and fresh panic. Gerald poured us both a cup of coffee and got straight to it. "Avery," he said, "I was wrong, Brandon was wrong, and now the company is paying for it." I nodded but said nothing. He continued, You have every right to walk away, but I am asking, before you do, let us find a way forward. The systems you built are the backbone of everything we do. You know that better than anyone. So what would it take to make this right? That was the first time he asked. Not demanded, not negotiated, but asked. And that changed the entire tone of the meeting. I told him I was not looking for revenge. I was looking for acknowledgement. I wanted my equity brought current, my licensing fees paid in full, and a formal reinstatement with a title that matched the role I had always played: Executive Director of Systems Integrity, with oversight, independent decision-making power, and a signed clause protecting my architecture from future tampering without written consent. Gerald nodded through every point. No arguments, no counteroffers, just understanding. Before I left, he stood and said, "You built something remarkable, Avery. I only regret I did not see it sooner." I looked him in the eye and replied, "You did see it. You just let your son talk you out of trusting it." Then I walked out, leaving behind a man who finally understood that legacy does not mean outdated. It means proven. And Brandon? He was just another lesson in what happens when ego outruns capability. We met at a rooftop cafe downtown. It was quiet, upscale, tucked away from the chaos of the street. Gerald chose the place, probably hoping the open air and skyline would soften the conversation. But I was not here for pleasantries. He looked thinner than I remembered. His shirt sleeves were rolled, his tie loosened, and his eyes told me he had not had a full night's sleep in days. I arrived right on time, ordered black coffee, and sat across from him with my bag on the table. He tried to smile, but his voice gave him away. "Avery, I know we failed you," he said. "I'll make this right." I smiled back, just enough to be polite. "Good," I replied, setting my phone face down, "because I am not coming back on goodwill alone." He nodded like he expected that, but I could see he was hoping I would go easy. I did not. I laid it out clearly. I want full back pay from the moment Brandon pushed me out, plus an equity recalculation based on the current market cap, and I want a 2-year non-exclusive license on my architecture. I paused and added, "That means you can use the code, but you do not own it. I retain IP rights. You will pay quarterly, and I maintain the right to license it elsewhere." His jaw tightened. "That is steep," he said carefully. I knew what he meant. He thought I would just want my old job back. He was hoping for a quick fix, but I was not negotiating from emotion. I was negotiating from leverage. Without blinking, I pulled a folded letter from my bag and slid it across the table. "That's from Sentinel Logistics," I said. "They reviewed my systems. They are prepared to license the entire framework at full market rate. I have not signed it yet, but I could." He unfolded the letter slowly, scanning the page. The silence was sharp, almost awkward. When he finally looked up, the weight in his face said everything. Sentinel was their biggest competitor, smarter, leaner, and already poaching their smaller clients. If I handed them my architecture, Cormac Freight would not just lose code. They would lose the one thing they still had over the competition: stability. My system ran 24 hours a day, 6 continents, and had not crashed once in over 10 years. Sentinel knew what it was worth. So did I. "I am not here to embarrass you, Gerald," I said calmly, "but I will not let this company get away with what happened. You let your son gamble with something I built from the ground up. If you want it back, you pay for it like you would pay any vendor. This is not personal anymore. It is business." His hands trembled slightly as he folded the letter and handed it back. "You're serious," he said. I nodded. I have never been more serious in my life. To his credit, he did not argue. He leaned back in his chair and sighed deeply. "You earned every line of that code," he said, "and you are right. We need to move forward with real terms." He reached for his phone. "I'll have legal draw something up." I stopped him. "No drafts until I approve the language. My counsel will review everything." He looked startled for a second, then nodded again. "Of course," he said. "I underestimated you. Again." We sat in silence for a moment, the city humming below us. I could tell he hated the position he was in, but he also knew he was lucky I was still at the table. Most people would have walked away. I chose to negotiate, not because I wanted revenge, but because I had value and it was time everyone acknowledged that. When the bill came, he tried to pay. I placed my hand over it. "I'll cover mine," I said. "This is not a favor, it is a transaction." He gave a small, tired laugh. "Fair enough." As I walked away from the table, sunlight warming my back, I did not feel angry anymore. I felt powerful. Because for the first time in my career, I was not asking for a seat. I was naming my price. The boardroom was filled to capacity, just like I expected. 10 members lined one side of the long walnut table, each with a laptop open and a paper folder in front of them. Some nodded as I walked in, others avoided my eyes. Gerald sat at the head, stone-faced, with a glass of water he had not touched. There was a tension in the air that made it feel like a courtroom, not a company meeting. I took my place near the screen and opened my laptop. I did not need to raise my voice. My words were sharper when they were calm. "Thank you for having me," I said, steady and clear. "Today I am here to confirm what some of you already know and others have been trying to deny. The entire operational framework running your freight logistics is mine. Intellectual property, architecture, logic structure, even the language tags. You have been using it without license since the day I was terminated." I clicked to bring up the first slide, a side-by-side code comparison showing time-stamped entries from 10 years ago against the current system's backend. Color-coded, annotated, indisputable. There were no questions, just silence and the sound of clicking pens. The next slide was Clause 9F from my contract. I read it out loud. "Any continued use of proprietary systems authored under Avery Kessler without active employment or signed license constitutes breach and is subject to penalties defined in Section 14D. My name was printed in bold on the original scan. Lydia Tan leaned forward, her brow furrowed. "These logs were verified?" she asked. "Third-party reviewed," I said, handing her a signed affidavit from my attorney. "And I am prepared to present them in court if necessary." Another board member shifted in his seat. I could feel the momentum tipping. The facts were too strong, the risk too high. They needed me, and I was not going to make it easy. I turned back to the screen. Here is a live demonstration. I opened a separate terminal and initiated a run of the ops system on a private cloud I had spun up the night before. Every major process triggered in under a second. Order routing, shipment tracking, customs clearance logic. Everything ran smoothly because I built it that way, and everything they needed to stay afloat was in this framework. When I finished, I turned and faced the table. "If you want to keep this company running past next quarter," I said, "you will need to pay for what you have already used." The vote took less than 5 minutes. 10 members voted yes. 1 abstained. No one voted no. Gerald looked relieved, maybe even grateful. "Avery," he said, standing, "we would like to offer you a formal return. Title, Chief Systems Integrity Officer. You would report directly to the board. Full autonomy, no interference from Brandon or anyone else." The room looked at me like they expected a smile. Instead, I closed my laptop and placed my hands on the table. "I appreciate the offer," I said, and I recognized the gesture, but no. Gerald blinked. "No." I nodded. That role would make me responsible for cleaning up someone else's mess again. I am not returning to fix what I already warned you about. I am offering you a path forward, but I am not stepping back into the building. I paused, letting the silence settle. "The licensing agreement stands. If you want continuity, we move forward that way. Otherwise, Sentinel gets first rights." There was no anger in my voice, no vengeance, just clarity. I had given this company more than a decade. They threw me out without a second thought. Now they were offering power like it was a prize, but I had found something better, freedom. Freedom to choose who I work with, who I trust, and where I put my name. And I was not giving that up, not even for a corner office with a fancy title. Gerald nodded slowly. "Understood," he said. "We will finalize the agreement as discussed." I stood up, collected my things, and gave one last glance around the table. No handshake, no farewell speech, just closure. When I walked out, the sunlight hit my face like a fresh start, and this time it was mine to define. I walked out of Cormac Freight for the last time with nothing in my hands and everything I needed in my inbox. A signed contract from Sentinel Logistics sat at the top of my email, with a welcome note from their CEO and a generous licensing deal that would pay out more than I had earned in my last 5 years at Cormac combined. My systems would continue to run, but this time under my terms, with my name protected, and without me carrying the burden of other people's poor decisions. I did not need an exit interview. I did not need a farewell party. I just needed the sun on my face and the weight off my shoulders. I took one last look at the building on my way out, not because I missed it, but because I wanted to remember the exact feeling of freedom. I had spent 12 years inside that place, building something no one thought was possible. I had written millions of lines of code that kept their logistics empire from falling apart. And when Brandon came in and decided that legacy was a dirty word, they nearly lost everything. He tried to clean my name out of the code base like it was an old stain, but code remembers, and so do I. Brandon, last I heard he was managing a regional warehouse in Nebraska. No executive perks, no corner office, no more digital transformation nonsense. He had been suspended during the board's investigation, and when the contracts began slipping through their fingers, the writing was on the wall. He had gone from promising heir to operational dead weight in less than 6 months. I did not gloat. I did not need to. Consequences have a rhythm of their own, and his had finally caught up to him. You can only write a last name so far before the system checks for real credentials. Gerald stepped down a month later. Quietly. No press release, no big send-off. I think he knew his time was up too. The board had made its choice, and so had I. We had sat across from each other like professionals, we had signed our names, and we walked away with what we both needed. For him, it was survival. For me, it was justice. Not revenge, not drama, just the quiet, steady correction of a story that had tried to cut me out. After I left, I took 2 weeks off. No screens, no servers, no late-night log checks. Just the open road and the silence that comes when you no longer owe anyone your energy. Then I started something new. Small at first, an advisory firm that helped female engineers protect their IP and navigate hostile work environments. I named it after the first line of code I ever wrote. There was something poetic about it. My phone started ringing within a week. People wanted help. Women like me, tired of being pushed out of the rooms they built. Some people said I should have stayed, taken the title, and fixed it from the inside. But I had done my time inside. I had given more than enough to a system that thought I was replaceable. And when they tried to overwrite me, they learned that you cannot rebuild the foundation when you do not understand how it was laid. You cannot steal brilliance and expect it to keep working without the person who brought it to life. In the end, I did not need applause. I did not need an award. I just needed the truth to hold up. And it did. The contracts, the architecture, the logs, the license, every piece stood firm because I had built them right the first time. I did not rush. I did not cheat. I did not take shortcuts. And that is why they could not tear it down, no matter how hard they tried. That is what legacy really means. So no, I did not burn the place down. I left the lights on, locked the door behind me, and handed them the keys to a system they no longer deserved. Because when you try to erase a woman's legacy, sometimes she writes you out of the story instead. And believe me, that ending is always better.